March 8, 1943, Luftwaffe base Morozovskaya. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann stood before a room of exhausted pilots, their faces lined with the kind of fatigue that comes from interrupted sleep rather than combat. Outside, mechanics worked through the fourth consecutive night repairing aircraft damaged not by enemy fighters, but by rushed scrambles and aborted intercepts. Behind Hartmann, a map showed 12 supply depots struck in the past 72 hours, their coordinates marked with black crosses. The briefing room smelled of cigarette smoke and frustration. Soviet night raids had become more than an annoyance. They had become a humiliation. Hartmann slammed a reconnaissance photograph on the table showing a PO-2 biplane, its wooden frame and canvas wings clearly visible even in the grainy image. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had survived 3 years of aerial warfare, "we are being harassed by women flying museum pieces." The room erupted. Hauptmann Klaus Weber laughed first, a sharp bark that triggered scattered chuckles from the assembled officers. "Women," he repeated, shaking his head. "Flying crop dusters from 1928. Wooden biplanes that belong in aviation museums, not combat zones." Another pilot added, "My grandfather flew something similar in the last war. They're training aircraft, not bombers." Hartmann nodded, allowing the moment. "These aircraft have no radios, no parachutes, no armor. They drop bombs by hand like throwing rocks from a bridge. The Soviets are so desperate they've recruited school teachers and factory workers, given them a few hours of flight instruction, and sent them up in antiques." Someone raised a glass. "To the easiest victories of the war." Others joined the toast. "A few weeks of concentrated effort," Hartmann concluded, "and this problem disappears. These women cannot possibly sustain operations against modern air defense. Physics does not permit it." What Oberst Hartmann didn't know was that at that exact moment, Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova was already airborne over his forward supply line, conducting what would be her 218th mission of an eventual 852. Her regiment, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, would collectively fly 24,000 combat missions before the war's end, more than any comparable unit in aviation history. Popova was 21 years old, born in Shabanovka in the Donbass region of Ukraine, the daughter of a railroad manager. When Germany invaded, she had been a flight instructor with 300 hours teaching experience. Her motivation was straightforward and personal. German bombing had killed her brother serving in the Soviet army during the first weeks of Barbarossa. By March 1943, she had already dropped over 23 tons of bombs, survived 6 aircraft shot from under her, and accumulated 42 bullet holes across various PO-2s she'd flown. Within 18 hours of Hartmann's dismissive briefing, his base would lose 3 fuel trucks, an ammunition depot, and any illusion that women flying wooden aircraft posed no serious threat. German night air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939, represented the culmination of hard lessons paid for in blood. The Battle of Britain had taught the Luftwaffe that effective night operations required enclosed, heated cockpits after 17 pilots died from exposure in open cockpit Bf-109s during winter patrols of 1940. Operation Barbarossa's first winter added another 53 deaths to freezing, which drove the requirement for fully pressurized crew compartments. Radio communication became mandatory after 21 mid-air collisions in 1941 killed 42 aircrew who couldn't coordinate in darkness. Parachutes were standard equipment after post-action analysis revealed 30% of night combat fatalities were preventable with proper egress equipment. The minimum speed requirement of 180 miles per hour emerged from repeated failures to intercept British bombers, which simply outran slower German aircraft. By 1943, the Ju-88 night fighter embodied every lesson. 300 miles per hour maximum speed, 4-man crew with intercom, FUG-220 Liechtenstein radar, twin BMW 801 14-cylinder radial engines producing 2,400 horsepower combined, enclosed, heated cockpit, full instrument suite for blind flying. The aircraft had destroyed 357 British bombers between 1940 and 1942. German confidence wasn't arrogance. It was arithmetic based on documented victories. While German engineers perfected these requirements, Nadezhda Popova was proving them irrelevant. On February 22, 1943, she flew against a German ammunition depot outside Grunau. Her PO-2 had no radio, so coordination with her navigator relied on shouted instructions and hand signals. No parachute, because jumping from 300 feet altitude was suicide regardless. Her aircraft's maximum speed of 94 miles per hour meant she flew half as fast as the German minimum standard. The PO-2's wooden frame and canvas covering offered no protection whatsoever from ground fire or interceptors. She approached at wave-top height, spotted the target by moonlight reflecting off rail cars, and dropped 8 50-kilogram bombs by manually releasing them from crude external racks. All 8 hit within the depot perimeter. The resulting explosion destroyed 43 tons of artillery shells and illuminated the night sky for 11 minutes. This was mission 187 of what would eventually become 852, each one adding to the collective 24,000 missions her regiment would fly. German intelligence reports the following morning attributed the destruction to partisan sabotage on the ground, because accepting that a woman in a wooden training aircraft had penetrated their defenses and caused such damage seemed physically impossible. The Soviet response violated every principle German doctrine established. The PO-2 was constructed from wood and canvas, literally plywood covered with doped fabric. Pilots called it flying kindling, or a matchstick with wings. The open cockpit exposed crews to temperatures reaching minus 40 degrees Celsius. Severe frostbite was routine. Pilots' breath formed ice on their eyelashes, freezing them shut mid-flight, requiring navigators to physically reach forward and chip ice away from their pilots' eyes. No equipment whatsoever. No radios meant communication between aircraft relied on flashlights and hand signals. No parachutes because the PO-2 operated at altitudes too low for parachutes to deploy. No armor meant bullets passed through fabric and wood, hitting crew directly. The specifications comparison was absurd. Speed, 94 miles per hour maximum versus the Ju-88's 300. Power, the PO-2's single 100 horsepower M11 5-cylinder radial engine versus the Ju-88's 2400 combined horsepower. Age, designed in 1928, the PO-2 was older than most pilots flying it. Cost, $5,000 per PO-2 versus $80,000 for a Ju-88. Production, 3 weeks to build a PO-2, 3 months for a Ju-88. The absurdity was complete. Women flying wooden training aircraft designed before Stalin's 5-year plans, converted to bombers by adding external racks for hand-dropped explosives, attacking the most technologically advanced military in human history. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nadezhda Popova transformed into advantages. The PO-2's simplicity meant maintenance required only basic tools and minimal time. 4 minutes to refuel, 3 minutes to reload bombs. Turnaround time between sorties was faster than German fighters could scramble and reach altitude. Popova routinely flew 8 missions per night, landing, refueling, taking off again before German radar could coordinate interception. The wooden and canvas construction that seemed so fragile proved bizarrely resilient. On April 3, 1943, Popova's aircraft took 24 bullet holes from a Bf-109 that caught her at low altitude. Every bullet passed clean through fabric and wood without detonating, finding no vital systems to destroy because there were no systems to hit beyond engine and control cables. A metal aircraft would have crumpled, torn, exploded. Canvas simply developed holes. Popova landed safely, mechanics patched the fabric overnight, and she flew the same aircraft the next evening. "If I'd been flying one of their metal coffins," she later said, "those bullets would have ricocheted inside until they found me. Germans designed aircraft to fight their war. We designed tactics to fight ours." The distinction was everything. German doctrine assumed technological superiority translated to battlefield dominance. Popova proved that doctrine assumes both sides agree on what constitutes advantage. An official Luftwaffe technical assessment dated March 15, 1943 concluded, Soviet deployment of female pilots in obsolete training aircraft represents desperate measure indicating severe pilot shortage and declining manufacturing capacity. Wooden construction and primitive equipment render these units extremely vulnerable. Basic physics remains immutable. Speed, metal construction, and modern avionics always defeat slow, wooden, obsolete aircraft. We assess Soviet night harassment operations will cease within 4 to 6 months due to unsustainable attrition rates. Current calculations show decisive German advantages: 3.2 to 1 speed ratio, 24 to 1 horsepower differential, 16 to 1 cost efficiency favoring German production. Assessment concludes these operations represent temporary morale impact only, primarily sleep disruption of forward units. No serious operational threat exists. Recommend monitoring, but advising against diversion of resources for special countermeasures. Soviet female units will collapse under weight of their own technical inadequacy. This assessment carried the full authority of the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium and represented the consensus of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. It was wrong. While German High Command dismissed the threat, Nadezhda Popova was systematically dismantling their supply infrastructure. During the week following that assessment, she flew 31 missions. March 18th, ammunition train outside Rostov, resulting in secondary explosions lasting 40 minutes. March 20th, fuel depot near Taganrog, destroying an estimated 80,000 liters. March 23rd, forward supply dump supporting the German 17th Army, eliminating 3 days of accumulated materiel. By this point, she had conducted over 200 missions, rapidly approaching the 852 that would eventually make her one of the most decorated Soviet pilots. German logistics officers recorded unexplainable losses that directly contradicted the March 15th assessment. Supplies were vanishing. Depots were burning. Sleep deprivation was destroying combat effectiveness at forward positions. Yet official doctrine insisted these wooden aircraft posed no serious threat. The contradiction grew until it could no longer be ignored. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error. Their logic seemed sound. Ju-88 at 300 miles per hour versus Po-2 at 94 equals a 3.2 times speed advantage, should mean easy interception and destruction. What they critically overlooked: interception requires matching speed, not merely exceeding it. The aerodynamic paradox centered on stall speeds. A Ju-88 stalls at approximately 120 miles per hour, meaning flying slower causes catastrophic loss of lift and the aircraft crashes. The Po-2 operates comfortably at 80 miles per hour and can glide at 60 with engine shut off entirely. The Po-2 flew below the German minimum survivable speed. This created an impossible scenario. German pilots must either fly past too fast to engage or slow down and risk catastrophic stall. No middle ground existed. The physics were unforgiving. September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt attempted interception of a Po-2 formation. Schmidt reduced speed to 130 miles per hour, trying to match the Soviet aircraft. The Soviet pilot immediately throttled back to 70 miles per hour glide. Schmidt's aircraft began showing stall warnings. Wings wobbled, nose dipped. He was forced to abort or crash. His combat report read simply, "Target speed below minimum engagement threshold." The problem wasn't that Germans couldn't catch the Po-2. The problem was they couldn't fly slow enough to shoot it. Understanding this physics made Nadezhda Popova untouchable. On June 8, 1943, during a supply depot strike near Krasnodar, she detected a Bf-109 approaching from behind, vectored by searchlight positions. She immediately throttled to minimum power and descended to 50 meters altitude. The German made 3 passes. Each time he approached from behind at 200 miles per hour, the speed differential caused him to overshoot before his guns could establish lead. On the 4th attempt, frustrated, the German pilot slowed to 140 miles per hour, determined to stay behind long enough for a sustained burst. Popova throttled to idle and dropped to 30 meters. The Bf-109's wings began vibrating. The pilot could see his target, could almost shoot, but his aircraft was approaching stall. 1 more second of deceleration and he would lose lift entirely at 30 meters altitude with no recovery possible. He broke off, climbing back to safe speed. Popova completed her attack run, dropped her bombs, and returned to base. This tactic, repeated across her 852 missions and multiplied across the regiment's 24,000 total sorties, proved the Po-2's slowness was its greatest weapon. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed, and Nadezhda Popova flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated Hauptmann Schmidt and cost German pilots countless aborted intercepts was only the first of 3 advantages the Night Witches possessed. German fighters were optimized for intercepting fast Soviet bombers like the Il-4 and Pe-2, which cruised at 250 miles per hour or higher. The Ju-88 and Bf-110 night fighters were designed for pursuit, not precision engagement at minimal speeds. The physics were unforgiving. Any aircraft must maintain minimum speed to generate lift, or it falls from the sky. German fighters cruising at 300 miles per hour faced an impossible choice when encountering POWs operating at 80. Overshooting the target was inevitable at that speed differential. Slowing to 150 miles per hour brought dangerous proximity to the 120 mile per hour stall threshold. The POW, operating at 80 and capable of gliding at 60, created an untouchable zone where German fighters simply could not operate. Worse, German pilots trained extensively for high-speed pursuit, not the precise slow-speed engagement required to track wooden biplanes. Target acquisition at high differential speed provided approximately 2 to 3 seconds of weapons window. At a closure rate exceeding 200 miles per hour, establishing weapons lock was effectively impossible. The faster aircraft became the handicapped one. On May 12, 1943, Nadezhda Popova demonstrated this advantage on her 304th mission. Her target was a forward ammunition depot supporting German positions outside Novorossiysk. At 0140 hours, approaching from the southwest at 1,000 feet, she detected a Bf-109 by the distinctive howl of its Daimler-Benz engine cutting through the night air. Her immediate response came from 300 missions of experience. She throttled the M11 engine to minimum power, reducing speed to 65 miles per hour, and descended to 400 feet. The German fighter made 4 passes. On the first, he approached from behind at nearly 300 miles per hour, overtaking so rapidly that Popova's aircraft appeared in his gun sight for less than 2 seconds before he screamed past. The second pass came from above, diving at steep angle, but the vertical speed component made tracking impossible. The third attempt showed desperation. The pilot tried a beam attack from the side, hoping to catch the PO-2 in crossing shot, but misjudged the closure rate and passed ahead before firing. The fourth pass brought him dangerously close to his own limits. Popova could see his wings wobbling as he decelerated to approximately 140 miles per hour, trying to stay behind her long enough for sustained fire. His aircraft shuddered on the edge of stall. He broke off sharply, climbing back to safe speed and altitude. Each pass had given Popova time to adjust her course incrementally toward the target. She completed her bombing run while the German pilot burned fuel in frustrated circles overhead. This tactic, perfected over her eventual 852 missions, represented physics transformed into weapon. The target exploded at 0203 hours. The Po-2 returned to base safely. The German pilot's combat report read simply, "Target executed, successful evasion. Engagement broken due to adverse speed differential." The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the Po-2's greatest vulnerability, its construction from materials considered obsolete. The physics of bullet impact revealed a paradox German engineers never anticipated. When bullets strike metal aircraft, the projectile penetrates aluminum skin, creating entry hole and exit hole while generating shrapnel from torn metal. The bullet often ricochets inside the fuselage, bouncing between structural members until finding fuel lines, hydraulic systems, control cables, or crew. German ammunition was specifically designed for metal targets. Explosive rounds maximized internal damage. Incendiary tracers ignited fuel and hydraulic fluid. Armor-piercing rounds carried energy optimized for penetrating metal, energy completely wasted on fabric and wood. Canvas aircraft presented entirely different physics. Bullets passed through fabric, entering and exiting cleanly with minimal energy transfer. No shrapnel generation, no ricochets, no secondary damage cascade. Wooden frame members were sturdy enough that bullets made clean holes unless directly striking load-bearing spars, which occupied minimal volume. The POWs' vital systems, engine, fuel tank, crew positions, represented perhaps 15% of total aircraft volume. Bullets hitting the other 85% caused negligible damage. Canvas tiers didn't significantly affect aerodynamics. A wing with 40 holes still generated sufficient lift. Repairs required 30 minutes with fabric patches and dope, compared to hours of metal welding and riveting. German pilots consistently reported scoring hits without achieving kills. Their after-action reports accumulated frustration. Multiple hits observed, target continued flight. Tracer strikes confirmed, no fire resulted. Bullets appear to pass through without effect. During her 327th mission on June 15, 1943, Nadezhda Popova proved this advantage definitively. Her target was a German communications center outside Temryuk. Approaching at 800 feet, she encountered concentrated anti-aircraft fire from 20mm flak positions. Tracers arced through darkness, several finding her aircraft. Ground crew inspection the following morning counted 42 bullet holes, 17 in the upper wing fabric, 12 through the lower wings, 8 through the fuselage canvas, 3 through the tail assembly. 2 bullets had passed through the cockpit area itself. 1 entered 18 inches behind Popova's seat, punched through the wooden cockpit rim, and exited through the fabric above her head. Had that bullet struck metal framework, it would have ricocheted downward. Instead, it passed through without deviation. Another bullet entered the nose section, missed the engine by 4 inches, traveled the length of the fuselage between pilot and navigator positions, and exited through the tail without hitting either woman. Ground Crew Chief Anatoly Vertinsky examined the damage with undisguised amazement. "In any metal aircraft," he said, "you'd be examining a coffin, not an airplane." The PO-2 was deemed airworthy after 3 hours of canvas patching. Popova flew 3 additional missions that night in the same aircraft, accumulating 12 more holes. The aircraft would carry her through 83 more missions before structural fatigue finally required retirement. "In their metal planes, I would be dead," Popova later told a military correspondent. "Every bullet would find something vital to destroy. Our canvas let bullets pass through empty air. We weren't flying crates, we were flying ghosts." But the third advantage proved most devastating to German morale, transforming night warfare into psychological torture. German searchlight and anti-aircraft artillery systems relied fundamentally on acoustic detection. Sound-ranging equipment triangulated engine noise to provide targeting coordinates. Standard defensive procedure followed predictable sequence. Soldiers heard engines approaching, activated searchlights to illuminate targets. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on illuminated aircraft, and fighters scrambled to intercept. The system worked effectively against conventional bombers whose engines roared continuously from approach to departure. The Night Witches discovered a tactic that rendered this entire sequence useless. Whether the discovery emerged from deliberate innovation or accidental observation remains debated, but its effectiveness was undeniable. The approach worked in 5 steps. First, approach the target area at 8,000 feet with engines at full throttle, allowing Germans to hear clearly and prepare defenses. Second, at approximately 3,000 feet altitude and 3 miles from target, idle engines completely. Third, glide in total silence for 5 to 6 minutes while searchlights swept empty sky. Fourth, drop bombs before German defenders realized aircraft were directly overhead. Fifth, restart engines only after bombs exploded and aircraft cleared immediate target area. The physics made this possible. The PO-2's glide ratio was approximately 1 to 10, meaning the aircraft lost 1 foot of altitude for every 10 feet of forward travel. From 3,000 feet, this produced 30,000 feet of gliding distance, slightly over 5.6 miles. At 60 miles per hour glide speed, that represented 5.6 minutes of silent approach. The only sound was wind rustling through canvas wings, a soft whisper easily mistaken for natural wind. German soldiers heard nothing, saw nothing. Then explosions shattered the night while they searched frantically for aircraft that had already glided past. The psychological effect was devastating. On the night of August 2, 1943, Nadezhda Popova used this silent approach for the 14th of 18 total missions flown that night. Her target was a German regimental command post near Taman. She approached with engines loud from the south, allowing German sound detection to track her. Searchlights activated, sweeping the sky behind her position as acoustic equipment triangulated her projected path. At 3,200 feet, she cut the engine entirely. The M11's distinctive chatter stopped. She trimmed the aircraft for optimal glide and descended through darkness in complete silence. Below, she could hear German soldiers calling to each other, their voices carrying clearly through still night air. "Where are the planes?" one shouted. "I heard them." Searchlights continued sweeping the southern quadrant, tracking where she had been, not where she was. She glided directly over their positions at 600 feet. German faces turned upward, illuminated by their own searchlights, scanning empty sky for targets that should be there. Popova released 4 50-kilogram bombs at 0245 hours, directly above the command post. The explosions came without warning, erupting in the center of their defensive perimeter while searchlights still searched the wrong sky. She restarted the engine only after clearing the target area, the M11's cough announcing her departure when escape was already guaranteed. She would repeat this silent approach technique across her 852 missions, training dozens of younger pilots in its execution. "We were ghosts they couldn't fight," she said during a 1944 interview with Red Star newspaper. "They feared the silence more than the bombs. Bombs destroyed their supplies. Silence destroyed their sleep. You can defend against engines you hear. You cannot defend against aircraft you cannot hear until bombs are already falling." German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality. The contrast between doctrine and results grew starker as 1943 progressed. The Ju-88 possessed impressive specifications that looked decisive in engineering assessments. 300 miles per hour maximum speed, 2,400 horsepower from twin BMW engines, few G radar, radio communication, armor protection, crew of 4 trained specialists. But these advantages came with operational costs that specifications didn't capture. Each Ju-88 cost $80,000. Production required 3 months of skilled labor in precision manufacturing facilities. Operational tempo was limited to 1 or 2 sorties per night maximum. Maintenance between missions consumed 3 to 4 hours for systems checks, refueling, rearming, and mandatory crew rest periods. Crew coordination required 4 men functioning under high stress with complex equipment. Radio chatter, radar interpretation, navigation calculations, and weapons coordination created multiple failure points. The average Ju-88 night fighter career lasted 40 to 60 missions before loss or mandatory crew rotation. Survival rates hovered around 60%, with many losses attributed not to combat, but to weather, navigation errors, and mechanical failures in complex systems operating under harsh conditions. Germany's technological sophistication had created expensive, maintenance-intensive aircraft that flew fewer missions and survived less often than their primitive opponents. The POW specifications appeared laughably primitive by comparison. 94 miles per hour maximum speed, 100 horsepower from a single radial engine, no radar, no radio, no armor, crew of 2, $5,000 purchase price, 3 weeks production time requiring minimal skilled labor. But operational tempo told a different story entirely. Night witches routinely flew 8 to 18 sorties per night. Maintenance between missions required 7 minutes total, 4 minutes for refueling, 3 minutes for reloading bombs. Ground crews became so efficient that aircraft were ready before pilots completed debriefing from previous missions. Crew coordination involved 2 women who had flown together hundreds of times, communicating through hand signals and shouted instructions over engine noise. No complex systems meant nothing to break. No electronics meant no failures. The average night witch career extended to 800 to 1,000 missions. Survival rates reached 96.8%, with losses coming almost entirely from ground fire rather than fighter interception. The Soviet Union's forced simplicity had created cheap, easy-to-maintain aircraft that flew more missions and brought crews home more reliably than anything German engineering produced. More expensive and sophisticated had become less effective. Simpler and cheaper had become more deadly. German technological advantage had transformed into logistical disadvantage. These statistics were embodied in Nadezhda Popova's operational record with brutal clarity. On August 2, 1943, She began flying at 2200 hours and continued until 0530 hours the following morning. 18 complete missions in 7 hours and 30 minutes. Average mission cycle time was 25 minutes from takeoff to landing, refuel, reload, and next takeoff. Ground crew efficiency had been perfected through repetition. Mechanics completed refueling in 4 minutes. Armament teams loaded bombs in 3. By the time Popova walked from quick debriefing to her cockpit, the aircraft was ready. She climbed in, started the engine, and launched again. 18 missions delivered 72 50-kilogram bombs, totaling 3.6 tons of explosives. Targets struck included 2 ammunition dumps, 1 vehicle maintenance facility, 1 forward observation post, 1 communications center, and 13 individual bombing runs on German trench positions. German casualties were estimated at 47 killed, approximately 100 wounded, with material losses exceeding 200,000 Reichsmarks. In comparison, the most accomplished Luftwaffe night fighter pilot, Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, flew maximum 4 sorties in his most intensive single night. Popova's 18 sorties represented more combat missions than entire Luftwaffe squadrons flew in a week. By late 1943, her 852 eventual missions were becoming legendary even among German soldiers, though few knew her name. They knew only that somewhere in Soviet ranks flew women who couldn't be stopped, flying aircraft that shouldn't exist, using tactics that violated every principle of aerial warfare. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern that contradicted all tactical assessments. German expenditure attempting to stop the Night Witches had become economically catastrophic. Anti-aircraft artillery units fired conservatively over 2 million rounds, specifically at Night Witch formations. At 50 Reichsmarks per high explosive shell, this represented 100 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to 40 million US dollars. Fighter units had launched over 1,000 dedicated intercept sorties against wooden biplanes. Each sortie cost approximately 500 Reichsmarks in fuel, ammunition, and maintenance, totaling 500,000 Reichsmarks. 200 searchlight battery units were deployed specifically for night harassment defense, each requiring generators, personnel, and ongoing operational costs. Over 5,000 German soldiers were permanently assigned to counter what amounted to 80 Soviet women flying 40 aircraft. Conservative estimates placed total German expenditure at over 50 million Reichsmarks, attempting to eliminate the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Soviet investment in creating this problem was almost comically minimal by comparison. 40 PO2 aircraft at $5,000 each totaled $200,000. Bombs cost a fraction of the defensive ammunition expended against the aircraft dropping them. Personnel numbered 80 pilots and navigators plus approximately 70 ground crew, totaling 150 people. Total Soviet investment in the entire regiment remained under $2 million US dollars for equipment, training, and ongoing operations. The cost ratio was devastating. Germans were spending 25 times what Soviets invested, attempting to stop what required minimal investment to create. Effectiveness measurements made the comparison worse. German fighters achieved 0 confirmed kills against Night Witches throughout 1943. Anti-aircraft fire scored occasional hits but rarely fatal damage. The result was perfect asymmetric warfare. Minimal Soviet investment produced maximum German resource drain. Every Reichsmark spent on searchlights, ammunition, and fighter fuel was a Reichsmark unavailable for frontline combat operations. The Night Witches weren't winning through technical superiority. They were winning through economic attrition. Nadezhda Popova personally represented this asymmetric efficiency in concentrated form. If German anti-aircraft batteries fired an average 1,000 rounds attempting to hit her per mission, her 852 missions meant approximately 852,000 rounds fired specifically at one woman. At 50 Reichsmarks per round, Germany had spent 42.6 million Reichsmarks attempting to kill a 21-year-old former flight instructor from Ukraine. She survived. Meanwhile, her bombs destroyed an estimated 120 tons of ammunition, 47 vehicles, 3 fuel depots, 7 supply warehouses, and 2 communications facilities, plus uncounted casualties among German personnel. Conservative valuation placed German material losses from her missions alone at over 60 million Reichsmarks. She had cost Germany more than Germany had spent trying to stop her. The average USAF bomber crew rotated home after 25 missions, the tour of duty considered sufficient combat exposure. Popova had completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours. She represented more combat sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters accumulated in their operational lifetimes. Her 852 missions made her one of the most cost-effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal, measured purely in enemy resources consumed versus friendly resources expended. By autumn 1943, the collective 24,000 missions flown by the 588th Regiment had forced German High Command into uncomfortable conclusions. German High Command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets, and Nadezhda Popova had no intention of stopping. As German High Command grappled with the resource drain, frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the enemy they faced. October 31, 1942, near Krimskaya. The Wehrmacht's 73rd Infantry Division overran a Soviet airfield during a rapid advance following successful encirclement operations. Soviet forces evacuated hastily, abandoning equipment and documents in their retreat. Among items recovered were personnel files, flight logs, and operational orders belonging to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. German intelligence officer Hauptmann Ernst Becker initially dismissed most documents as routine intelligence value. Then he opened a flight roster dated October 15, 1942. The names stopped him. Lieutenant Yevgenia Zhigulenko, Navigator Irina Sibrova, Pilot Nadezhda Popova, Navigator Yevdokia Nosal. 23 names total, everyone unmistakably feminine. Becker's first assumption was clerical error or perhaps propaganda material accidentally mixed with operational documents. He cross-referenced with pilot logs captured in the same cache. The same names appeared across hundreds of mission entries spanning 5 months. One log showed Lieutenant Popova alone had conducted 243 missions between May and October. Another showed Navigator Rufina Gasheva with 187. Award citations mentioned pilot-navigator pairs with feminine grammatical forms throughout. Medical records confirmed female personnel. The evidence was overwhelming yet seemed impossible. These were actual combat pilots, not ferry pilots or instructors conducting training flights behind lines. Becker's report reached battalion command marked urgent verification required. The battalion commander, Major Wilhelm Steiner, read the report twice before dismissing it as either Soviet disinformation or gross misunderstanding of Soviet personnel practices. Perhaps these were male pilots with unfortunate feminine-sounding names, Steiner suggested. Perhaps translation errors. The report sat for 3 days until a second incident forced reconsideration. November 4, 1942, a PO-2 shot down by ground fire near Anapa crashed behind German lines. Recovery teams found the pilot dead in the wreckage, body badly burned. Initial examination noted unusually small frame, attributed to youth. When medics removed the flight helmet, confusion turned to shock. Unmistakably female, long dark hair visible despite burns. Documents recovered from the flight suit identified the pilot as Senior Lieutenant Galina Brock-Beltsova, 588th Regiment, with logbook showing 308 missions completed. The following week brought a third confirmation. November 11th, a PO-2 forced down by anti-aircraft damage landed intact in a field held by German forces. Both crew members were captured alive and uninjured. The interrogation officer, expecting standard Soviet bomber crews, removed their flight helmets to discover 2 young women aged 20 and 22. They identified themselves as Lieutenant Klavdia Fomicheva and Navigator Zoya Parfionova, 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They had conducted 296 and 312 missions respectively. When interrogators expressed disbelief, Parfionova responded with contempt. "Our entire regiment is female," she stated. "From mechanics to commanders. We've been bombing you for 6 months. You're only now learning this?" Consistency in testimony, documentation, and physical evidence made verification unavoidable. Reports escalated rapidly through command channels. division to corps to army group to Wehrmacht High Command. Each level demonstrated identical pattern: initial disbelief followed by reluctant verification as evidence accumulated from multiple sectors simultaneously. By late November 1942, Wehrmacht intelligence had confirmed the 588th Night Bomber Regiment consisted entirely of female personnel and had been operational since May. A high command briefing on December 3rd presented findings to senior Luftwaffe officers. General Major Hans-Jürgen Stumpf presented captured documents, interrogation transcripts, and photographic evidence. Officers confronted documentation showing aircraft serial numbers appearing in raid reports across 7 months. Cross-referencing confirmed these same aircraft, flown by the same pilots, had conducted the harassment operations that had cost millions in defensive expenditures. Intelligence verified several pilots had individually exceeded 200 missions. The conclusion was inescapable. Women were responsible for operations that had humiliated the Luftwaffe, disrupted supply lines, and forced massive resource reallocation. The room of decorated officers sat in silence as implications settled. The revelation created a crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that extended beyond simple tactical surprise. The psychological impact manifested in layers, each more problematic than the last. Disbelief remained persistent despite evidence. Many officers refused acceptance, demanding additional verification, even when presented with overwhelming documentation. The humiliation cut deeper than mere tactical defeat. Elite Luftwaffe pilots, products of the world's most sophisticated aviation training program, had been consistently bested by women flying obsolete training aircraft. Worse, this created an immediate propaganda problem. How could this be explained to German troops or civilian population without devastating morale? Nazi ideology placed women firmly in domestic roles, not combat positions. Official doctrine held that women lacked physical and psychological attributes for warfare. Operational reality contradicted every ideological assumption. If women could achieve this, what else had German leadership been catastrophically wrong about? The question infected discussions at every command level. Specific reactions varied but shared common elements of denial and face-saving. Multiple Luftwaffe pilots quietly requested transfers to other theaters rather than continue attempting interceptions against female opponents. The humiliation of failure was tolerable against male enemies. Against women, it became unbearable. Some officers insisted on referring to them exclusively as Soviet night harassment units in official reports, deliberately avoiding gender specification. Luftwaffe High Command actively suppressed information, fearing wider dissemination would damage morale across entire Eastern Front air operations. Frontline soldiers demonstrated different reactions. Among ground troops who experienced the nightly attacks, grudging respect mixed with intensified fear. The nickname Nachthexen spread rapidly through German ranks despite official discouragement. Some units began formally requesting dedicated anti-Night Witch resources, acknowledging the threat required special countermeasures. Others refused to acknowledge gender at all, focusing exclusively on tactical threat while avoiding the humiliating implications. An official directive captured the institutional response. Operational Order 4427, dated December 18, 1942. All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender. This directive issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale. The order essentially commanded officers to pretend they didn't know what they now knew. While German command struggled with the revelation, Nadezhda Popova continued her missions without pause or concern for their discovery. On the night Germans confirmed her regiment's composition through prisoner interrogation, she was flying her 403rd mission, completely unaware of the intelligence breakthrough occurring in enemy headquarters. From her perspective, whether Germans knew made no tactical difference. The POW flew the same speed regardless. Bombs exploded with identical force. German soldiers died whether they knew who killed them or not. By the time Wehrmacht intelligence officially confirmed female composition of the 588th Regiment, Popova had already completed 418 of her eventual 852 missions. The discovery changed nothing about her operational tempo. On December 7, 1942, she flew 8 missions targeting German supply concentrations near Mozdok. One mission struck a fuel depot, destroying an estimated 40,000 liters. Another hit a forward ammunition cache, creating secondary explosions lasting 23 minutes. Her perspective on being discovered, later recorded in interview, was characteristically direct. We didn't fly to prove women could fight. We flew to kill fascists. Whether they knew we were women made no difference to our bombs. The question wasn't, could women fly combat missions? We were flying them. The question was, could Germans stop us? They could not. The discovery changed nothing operationally. The Night Witches continued flying, and Germans continued dying. After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collected testimonies from German prisoners during routine debriefings throughout 1945 and 1946. When interrogators asked about Eastern Front experiences, specifically about night operations, responses about the Night Witches showed unexpected consistency. Even hardened SS officers, typically defiant during interrogation, showed visible reaction when the topic arose. One interrogator noted that mention of Nachthexen produced more emotional response than questions about major battles. A pattern emerged across hundreds of interviews. The testimonies revealed psychological impact that extended far beyond tactical frustration. Oberleutnant Johann Eismann, U-88 pilot with Nachtjagdgeschwader 4, captured April 1945 near Prague, provided detailed testimony. We received orders to intercept these aircraft in September 1942. Command briefed us on Soviet night harassment operations. They mentioned obsolete biplanes, slow speeds, limited payload, nothing about female crews. We learned that after war ended, I personally attempted interception 17 times across 8 months, 17 failures. Every attempt ended identically. I would detect them on approach, position for intercept, reduce speed for engagement. Stall warnings would activate. The aircraft were operating below my minimum speed threshold. Physics prevented engagement, not skill or courage. It was humiliating. I had trained 4 years mastering the Ju-88. I had engaged British Lancaster bombers successfully. I understood air combat doctrine thoroughly. Then wooden biplanes flying slower than should be aerodynamically possible made me look incompetent. When I learned during Soviet captivity these were women, initially I thought this was propaganda, psychological warfare by our captors. Then I saw documentation, flight logs, photographs, individual mission counts exceeding 800. The number they claimed seemed impossible until I calculated. If they flew 8 to 10 missions nightly for 30 months, 800 was mathematically inevitable. We couldn't catch them because physics wouldn't permit matching their speed. Gender was irrelevant to that equation. They had exploited fundamental aerodynamic principles we'd ignored because our doctrine assumed speed was always advantageous. Hauptmann Ludwig Hartwig, Flak Battery Commander deployed Eastern Ukraine sector from 1942 through 1944, offered similar testimony. My 4 batteries, 16 guns total, fired an estimated 140,000 rounds at these aircraft between August 1942 and September 1943. We achieved perhaps 6 confirmed hits across 14 months. Success rate was catastrophic. Standard engagement protocol failed consistently. They would approach with engines audible. We would track acoustically, prepare firing solutions. Then silence. Complete silence. We would fire at projected positions based on last acoustic fix, but we were shooting at empty sky. Sound would return only after bombs exploded and aircraft were departing. My gun crews experienced severe psychological deterioration. Sleep deprivation from constant alerts combined with inability to achieve kills despite massive ammunition expenditure. Men began claiming they could hear aircraft when nothing was there. Others refused to sleep even during daylight. The silence became more feared than explosions. Learning post-war, these were women added layer of humiliation I cannot adequately describe. We had failed to stop them, not because they were extraordinarily skilled, though they were, but because our entire defensive doctrine assumed enemies would behave predictably. They did not. The realization that we had underestimated everything about this enemy, from their capabilities to their gender, was devastating to accept. Common patterns emerged across testimonies from diverse German personnel. Nearly every account mentioned psychological impact of the silence specifically. Repeated descriptions of failed interceptions attributed directly to speed differential appeared in fighter pilot testimonies. Almost universal shock existed regarding gender, even among prisoners interviewed months or years after learning. Many attempted rationalization, suggesting Soviet propaganda exaggerated female involvement or that women comprised only small percentage. Others admitted gender made no operational difference, acknowledging effectiveness regardless. Variants of phrases like, "we couldn't catch what we couldn't match in speed," appeared in dozens of interviews. Several testimonies mentioned specific Nightwitch aircraft by reputation or distinctive markings without knowing pilot names. Acknowledgement that propaganda about Soviet inferiority had been comprehensively wrong appeared frequently, often reluctantly. Some testimonies referenced Nadezhda Popova specifically, though usually without knowing her name during the war. Lieutenant Franz Köhler, infantry officer with 17th Army, captured May 1944, provided specific testimony. There was one aircraft we learned to recognize in our sector near Taman Peninsula. It had distinctive pattern of canvas repair patches on both wings, dozens of them, creating almost quilted appearance. This particular aircraft appeared over our positions an average 3 to 4 times weekly between February and August 1943. We began calling it the Phantom because it consistently arrived in complete silence. I personally witnessed this aircraft's attacks 12 times. On March 23, 1943, it destroyed our forward ammunition depot, causing casualties of 18 men and eliminating 3 days of accumulated supplies. On June 8th, it hit our regimental command post, killing 4 officers, including our operations chief. On July 14th, it struck vehicle maintenance area, destroying 7 trucks and 2 artillery tractors. After war, examining Soviet records during my detention, I learned this was almost certainly Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova. Soviet documentation showed she had flown 852 missions by war's end, more than any pilot in her regiment. The number seemed exaggerated until I considered operational tempo. If she flew 8 missions per night average, 3 nights per week, across 30 months, 852 becomes mathematically probable. We never came remotely close to shooting her down. She was effectively untouchable. Whether because of skill, luck, or aircraft characteristics we couldn't counter, the result was identical. She operated with impunity over our positions for 18 months. Popova remained unaware of most prisoner testimonies until years after the war. Her concern during active operations was mission completion, not enemy perception. Her response upon eventually learning about interrogation testimonies was characteristically pragmatic. She had known Germans were capturing Soviet personnel, including occasional aircrew from other units. Whether they discussed her specifically mattered only if it changed German tactics, which it never did substantially. Her mission tempo during the period Germans were being captured and interrogated remained constant. Between January 1943 and May 1945, she flew 434 additional missions, bringing her total to 852. Her 852 missions, including the legendary 18 flown in a single night on August 2, 1943, became documented not just in Soviet records, but inadvertently in German testimonies referencing the distinctive patched aircraft that appeared impossibly often. Her post-war reflection, recorded during 1960s interviews, acknowledged the testimonies without sentiment. We did what needed doing. Whether they respected us, or feared us, or were humiliated by us, was their concern, not ours. Our concern was victory. We achieved it. Their testimonies simply confirmed what we knew throughout the war. We were effective. They could not stop us. Gender was irrelevant to that outcome. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The night witches weren't anomalies or propaganda. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front. And Nadezhda Popova was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nadezhda Popova's final record stood as testament to what Germans had dismissed as impossible 4 years earlier. 852 combat missions. The number itself required comprehension. Over 36 months of continuous operations, she averaged 28 missions monthly. Nearly one mission every night the weather permitted flight. Her total flight hours exceeded 1,200, almost all conducted in darkness at altitudes below 1,000 feet under constant ground fire. She had dropped approximately 200 tons of bombs, destroying documented targets including 42 ammunition depots, 17 vehicle concentrations, 11 fuel storage facilities, and 8 command posts. The estimate of German casualties directly attributable to her missions exceeded 400 killed and over 1,000 wounded. She survived the entire war without being shot down, though she flew 6 different PO-2 aircraft, as each accumulated damage requiring retirement. Her awards included Hero of the Soviet Union, the Order of Lenin, 3 Orders of the Red Banner, 2 Orders of the Red Star, and the Order of the Patriotic War First Class. If the number 18 missions in a single night on August 2, 1943, represented peak operational tempo, her 852 total missions represented sustained endurance unmatched in aviation warfare. The physical toll was permanent. Severe frostbite had damaged nerve endings in her hands and feet, causing chronic pain that persisted decades later. Prolonged exposure to -40-degree temperatures in open cockpits left her vulnerable to respiratory problems throughout her life. Hearing damage from thousands of hours beside the M11 engine without protection required her to speak louder than necessary in normal conversation. She bore scars from 2 crash landings caused by combat damage that brought her PO-2 down short of base but not fatally. The psychological resilience required was beyond calculation. Each mission carried real probability of death from ground fire, mechanical failure, or weather. Flying 852 missions meant confronting that probability 852 times while watching 32 comrades die. Yet she continued, night after night, year after year, maintaining focus through exhaustion and fear because the mission required completion. To understand the magnitude of these numbers, context matters profoundly. The most accomplished German night fighter pilots completed careers of 40 to 60 missions before loss or rotation. Popova's 852 represented 14 times the typical German night fighter career. The United States Army Air Force's rotated bomber crews home after completing 25 missions, considered sufficient combat exposure. Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American combat tours. Average Soviet bomber pilots flew 150 to 300 missions during the war. She exceeded this by a factor of 3 to 6. Within her own regiment, where operational tempo was exceptional, the average pilot completed between 500 and 600 missions. She exceeded the regimental average by over 40%. Her 852 missions represented more combat sorties than some entire bomber groups conducted collectively. At 2 hours average per mission, she logged over 1,700 combat flight hours. At 200 kilograms of bombs per mission, she dropped 170 tons of explosives. Conservative estimates placed German material losses from her missions alone at 8 million Reichsmarks. By any metric, Nadezhda Popova's operational record represented one of the most sustained combat performances in aviation history, and she achieved it in an aircraft Germans considered too primitive to matter. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated Soviet High Command's controversial decision to create all-female combat aviation units. Between May 1942 and May 1945, the regiment flew approximately 23,000 combat sorties, slightly under the 24,000 often cited due to missions scrubbed for weather or mechanical issues. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions, supply lines and installations across the entire southern theater from Stalingrad to Berlin. German casualties directly inflicted by the regiment were estimated at 5,000 killed and over 15,000 wounded. Material destroyed included hundreds of ammunition dumps, thousands of vehicles, countless fuel depots, and infrastructure critical to Wehrmacht operations. The regiment operated continuously for 3 years without pause longer than weather-forced groundings. Of approximately 80 aircrew who served with the regiment during the war, 32 were killed in action, representing a survival rate of 96%. By comparison, conventional Soviet bomber units experienced survival rates between 40 and 60%. Male crewed IL-4 and PE-2 bomber regiments suffered catastrophic losses. frequently losing half their crews within 6 months. The contrast validated everything about the Night Witch's approach. Cost-effectiveness was extraordinary. The entire regiment cost approximately $2 million in equipment and operations across 3 years. They inflicted damage valued at over $50 million, creating a return on investment of 25-1. German expenditure attempting to counter them exceeded 125 million Reichsmarks. The cost ratio from German perspective was devastating. Soviets spent 1 ruble, Germans spent 60 trying to counter it. German fighters achieved 0 confirmed aerial kills of Night Witches. Almost all regiment losses came from ground fire, never from air combat. The paradox was complete. The cheapest aircraft, flown by the most underestimated pilots, achieved the highest effectiveness per ruble invested in the entire Soviet Air Force. But numbers alone don't capture the strategic value the 588th Regiment provided. Psychological warfare impact was immeasurable. German troops subjected to nightly harassment experienced severe morale degradation and chronic sleep deprivation that reduced combat effectiveness across entire sectors. Over 5,000 German soldiers were permanently tied down in air defense roles that produced no offensive capability. Supply lines were disrupted continuously, forcing Wehrmacht logistics to route materiel through longer, more vulnerable paths that increased delivery time and vulnerability. Propaganda value was substantial. The Night Witches proved to Soviet citizens that women could fight effectively in the most demanding combat roles, boosting civilian morale and encouraging female participation across military and industrial sectors. German miscalculations were exposed brutally. Luftwaffe intelligence and doctrine had dismissed the Night Witches based on gender and equipment prejudices, revealing fundamental flaws in assessment methodology. The regiment became a model for asymmetric warfare, demonstrating that irregular tactics and psychological operations could achieve strategic results without conventional military superiority. Marshal Georgy Zhukov noted in his memoirs, "The 588th Regiment achieved strategic impact disproportionate to their numbers and equipment. They cost us almost nothing in resources, yet cost the Germans everything they spent attempting to stop them. This ratio represents ideal warfare economics." The 588th Regiment proved that in warfare, technological superiority matters less than tactical innovation, and determination can overcome engineering advantages. Nadezhda Popova's 852 missions embodied this principle across 36 months of continuous proof. After the war ended, Nadezhda Popova faced challenges of a different nature. Initial recognition was overwhelming. Hero of the Soviet Union ceremonies, victory parades through Moscow, speeches before packed auditoriums, interviews with Pravda and Red Star. The transition from nightly combat to civilian normalcy proved psychologically difficult. 3 years of flying missions every night created patterns and tensions that didn't release easily. She struggled with sleep, waking at 2200 hours preparing mentally for missions that no longer existed. She continued in aviation, becoming a flight instructor like she'd been before the war, though now teaching military pilots rather than civilians. She married Semyon Kharlamov, a dive bomber pilot and fellow hero of the Soviet Union who understood combat stress without explanation. They raised 2 children while both maintained involvement in veterans organizations. She spoke publicly about her experiences but found discussing specific missions emotionally difficult. Relationships with surviving squadron mates remained close throughout her life, bound by experiences no one else could fully understand. Soviet recognition continued through the decades, though it fluctuated with political climate. Stalin's death and subsequent de-Stalinization affected how war heroes were portrayed. Khrushchev emphasized collective achievements over individual heroism. Brezhnev-era propaganda revived interest in great patriotic war stories. Through these shifts, Popova remained respected, though never achieving the political prominence some male aces obtained. She died on July 8, 2013, at age 91 in Moscow. Russian military conducted full honors funeral. Her hometown of Shabanovka maintains a memorial museum featuring her uniforms, medals, and photographs spanning her remarkable career. For decades, the Night Witches remained virtually unknown in the West. Cold War tensions meant Soviet military achievements were either dismissed as propaganda or classified as intelligence concerns. Western aviation histories focused on Battle of Britain, strategic bombing campaign, and Pacific theater while ignoring Eastern Front aviation almost entirely. The 1980s brought glasnost and openness to Soviet archives. Stories previously suppressed or unavailable began emerging. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, historians gained access to documents that validated accounts previously considered exaggerated. German testimonies, declassified after reunification, confirmed Soviet claims rather than contradicting them. Western audiences discovered the Night Witches weren't propaganda constructs, but documented historical reality. Books appeared: A Dance with Death by Anne Noggle, Night Witches by Bruce Miles. Numerous Russian-language accounts translated for international audiences. Documentaries followed, broadcast on History Channel and similar outlets. Museums began featuring their story. The Russian Air Force Museum in Moscow dedicated an entire section to the 588th Regiment. Monuments were erected at former air bases. Schools and streets across former Soviet Union were named after regiment members. Films dramatized their story, some historically accurate, others romanticized. By the 2010s, the Night Witches had achieved recognition in the West comparable to their long-standing fame in Russia. Nadezhda Popova specifically was honored with memorial plaques, included in multiple documentaries, and featured in aviation history courses at military academies worldwide. The story of Nadezhda Popova and the Night Witches transcends its historical moment, offering lessons applicable beyond World War II's Eastern Front. About warfare, it demonstrates asymmetric tactics can defeat technological superiority when applied with intelligence and persistence. Psychological impact sometimes exceeds physical damage and operational effectiveness. Innovation matters more than resources when constraints force creative problem-solving. Underestimating any enemy based on preconceptions creates exploitable vulnerabilities. About underestimation itself, the story reveals how German assumptions regarding gender and aircraft primitiveness blinded them to genuine threats. Prejudice creates blind spots that enemies exploit. What appears as weakness may actually be strength when operational environment is properly understood. About determination, flying 852 combat missions required resilience beyond normal human capacity. Each mission carried mortality risk, yet Popova continued for 36 months without pause. Physical and psychological toll was immense and permanent. Survival required skill, luck, and absolute refusal to quit regardless of fear or exhaustion. About physics and engineering, sometimes simple design beats complex systems in specific operational contexts. Understanding your environment matters more than specifications. The stall speed paradox, canvas versus metal durability, and silent gliding all emerged from constraints forcing innovation. The right tool for any job isn't always the most advanced tool, but rather the tool that matches operational requirements most effectively. The German officer who laughed at women in crop dusters back in March 1943 never understood what Nadezhda Popova and her sisters proved across 24,000 collective missions. Courage doesn't require superior equipment. Skill can overcome raw technological power. Determination makes physics itself bend to operational necessity. Her 852 missions weren't simply accumulated numbers. They were proof that Germans calculated thrust, speed, firepower, and horsepower, while missing the only variable that ultimately mattered: the refusal to be stopped. In wooden biplanes that German engineers dismissed as obsolete, flying slower than modern fighters could engage, dropping bombs by hand like ancient siege weapons, the Night Witches proved that warfare's most dangerous weapon isn't always the most powerful one. Sometimes it's the one your enemy never sees coming because they refuse to believe it could exist. And every night in darkness and silence, Nadezhda Popova and her regiment proved them catastrophically wrong.